What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, so I've been kind of on a linguistics and language kick lately. Today we're checking out Is English Just Badly Pronounced French? This one is coming from RobWords. I've checked out one of his videos. What did we do it on? I think we did it on how easy it is to learn German. I believe that's what it was. If you haven't seen that video, right up here. So, is English just badly pronounced French? Is French a Germanic language originally? I don't know. You guys have so many languages. I've been learning so much. What do you have? Like Slavic, Germanic languages, and then, oh gosh, Latin, right? So those are kind of like the three major that everything kind of came off of. I don't know. I'm rambling. If it's your first time here, my name's Jacob. I'm an American just learning everything about Europe. So today we're jumping into some linguistics with, is English French? I don't know. All right, buckle up. Let's go.
The English language doesn't exist. It's just badly pronounced French. Those aren't my words. They're supposedly the words of this 20th century French statesman. And they're the name of a book by this French linguistics professor who thinks the English-speaking world should be grateful to France.
C'est grâce au français que l'anglais est international.
Is he right? How French is English after all? Let's find out in another RobWords.
I am
So
super
English
curious.
is a Germanic language. Some people will try to tell you it
yes,
isn't for reasons
right.
that will become clear, but it is. Old English was brought to the British Isles by Germanic tribes. It was closely related to the languages that became German and Dutch. And in fact, it's not totally ridiculous to claim that a modern-day German would have a better chance of understanding Old English than a modern-day Brit. Old English is really nothing like the English that we speak today. It had grammatical gender, you had to put words in a different order, and it had all these complicated variable endings for nouns, adjectives, and verbs. But a millennium and a series of historical events have changed our language completely. And perhaps the single biggest event was this. In 1066, the French arrived, specifically the Normans, and English would never be the same again. As Professor Cerquilini puts it in his book, without the Normans, English would today be a second Dutch. Would that be so bad? And the thing is, he's sort of right. When the Norman king
I've heard both. I've heard that Dutch is the easiest and the hardest language to learn.
William the Conqueror seizes the throne of England, he initiates a period of enormous linguistic change. He kicks out all the English nobles and replaces them with his pals. He sacks all the English bishops, bar one, and puts Normans in their place. And suddenly, anyone with any power in England is speaking French. And that remains the case for a few centuries. You know, one of England's most celebrated kings, particularly by English nationalists, Richard the Lionheart, spoke barely a word of English. That's if he spoke any English at all. So French was the language of the elite. It became the language of government, chivalry, and art. All French words, by the way. As a result, French words from these fields start to stream into the English language. You needed to know them to get anything done. And to this day, many of our words for power, justice, and culture are from French. Words like parliament, council, court, judge, prince, battle, painting, music. I could go on.
These are all French words? I had no idea. I absolutely love learning this stuff. It's so interesting. I'm a history buff, if you guys didn't know. So anytime anything has to do with history, but like never really dived into language too much. It's just fascinating.
And I will. Tax, bill, jury, prison, baron,
Oh, we got more.
Culture, theatre, mayor, minister. I could still go on. And I will. Words like attorney, rule, economy, faith, war, peace. I think you've got the picture. And what also happens is the names for traders and artisans start to change too. They take on more prestigious sounding French names. The Old English fleshmonger is replaced by the Old French butcher. The tree wright becomes the carpenter. The chapman becomes the merchant. And we end up with barbers, drapers, grocers, masons, and tailors. All words from French. And the power dynamic between the lowly English and the Norman nobility is apparent even in our language today. We've ended up with two words for a lot of animals, an Old English-derived one for when they're alive and a French one for when they're served up for dinner. We have cow and beef, sheep and mutton. deer and venison, because the English would encounter them on the farm,
Venison.
and the Normans would encounter them on the plate. You've perhaps heard all of that before. I'm by no means the first to point it out. In fact, Walter Scott tackled it way back in 1820 in Ivanhoe, his tale of an Anglo-Saxon noble family surrounded by Normans. In it, the jester, Wamba, says, "Old Alderman Ox continues to hold his Saxon epithet while he's under the charge of serfs and bondsmen such as thou, but becomes Beef, a fiery French gallant, when he arrives before the worshipful jaws that are destined to consume him. Mynheer Calf, too, becomes Monsieur de Vaux in the like manner. He's Saxon when he requires tendance, and takes a Norman name when he becomes matter of enjoyment." Many of our words for a fancy banquet come from French too. A servant may bring you your dinner or serve you a bottle with supper.
Okay, this is absolutely blowing my mind. All these English words that I've always used, I always just thought were English words, are actually like French words. It's kind of mind-blowing. I don't remember learning any of this in school.
Of these coming up. But if all this talk of French has got you thinking, man, I really should get round to learning another language, allow me to help you out with that, because viewers of this video can get a special discount at Lingoda. Lingoda is a great place to learn a language because its approach is all about getting you speaking to real people as soon as possible. This is essential the way I see it, because from my own experience...
I'm gonna have to check out Lingoda. I'm using Babbel, but if he's recommending this one, I might do that. We'll get past the ad right now, but he's got a link down in the description if y'all want to learn another language. Check out Lingoda.
Okay, back to the many French words in English. And like with the meats, our names for family members show the former prestige of the French language. Our closest family have Anglo-Saxon names: mother, daughter, father, and son. These words have all been with us since Old English. But niece, nephew, aunt, uncle, cousin, they're all French words. You need to be able to describe non-nuclear family members when it comes to matters of hierarchy and succession.
What did Old English use for these before then? I mean, he kind of explained why we made the switch from them implementing the Normandy French into basically a very important position. But like, why did they keep some Old English words and then switch over some to French? Did they just not have a word for a niece or a nephew or an aunt? I wonder if he's going to cover it right now. Kind of curious.
When you're only ever handing the family farm down to the next generation. During this period, which we call the Middle English period, the appetite for taking French words is pretty much insatiable. In fact, in some cases, we even took the same French words twice, but in slightly different forms. William the Conqueror and his lot brought over a specific dialect of Old French, Norman French. It was spoken in northern France and was a version of French influenced by Germanic pronunciations. The Normans were essentially Vikings who'd settled in northern France and learned the lingo. It's what the word Norman means. But a bit less than a century after William first claims England for himself, the crown passes down to the Plantagenets, a dynasty that spoke a different dialect to William, one that came from central France. So check this out. When Norman French used a w sound at the start of a word, the central French dialect tended to use a g. The Normans made a k sound where their counterparts to the south made a ch, and they made a ch sound where Central French made a s. Now, during the Middle English period, English took on versions of the same word from both dialects, many of which remain with us today. We took, for example, both warden and guardian, warranty and guarantee, wage and gauge, catch and chase. Now, these words meant the same as each other, but when we took them on, we charged each with its own nuance. And that tactic of borrowing a word but giving it a slightly narrower meaning is a tactic that has helped make English the gloriously rich language that it is. Because instead of French words replacing Anglo-Saxon words, a lot of the time they sat alongside them. For example, we can still ask for something, but we can also demand it. We can answer and we can respond. We can wish and desire, begin and commence.
This is really like blowing my mind here. I wonder if just the scope of language back then wasn't just as large as it is now, that when you have like these different cultures kind of like meshing together, somebody may have a word for something that you're trying to, make a point of or get across, and you've never really had a word for it, to whereas the other culture has it, and you're kind of just like, oh, we're going to take that. And I feel like this happens even now here in the States. I can't think any off the top of my head, but I know there are some that, like the Spanish language in Mexico, they'll have a name for something that we didn't even have a name for. And I've heard it before. Don't quote me on it. I can't think of it right now, but I've heard these words before where I'm like, oh, that's a good way to explain that thing. It's fascinating.
Saxon versions and the French-derived versions. So English takes on vast amounts of French words during this Middle English period, but it also never really gets out of the habit, even after French stops being the language of the ruling class, a process that begins with the English crown losing Normandy in 1204 and ends arguably with the 100 Years' War between England and France, when speaking French
I gotta do a
England
video on the 100 Years'
no longer
War.
de rigueur, but something of a faux pas. Over the centuries since then, we've continued to take on French words, mainly because French has always been a bit prestigious. It's fancy. So we've given various Anglo-Saxon nouns florid French adjectives. Things concerning the brain are mental, things in our house are domestic, and our towns are urban. A lot of that's just the result of a fashion in the 15th century. And as the professor points out, in the 18th century, a mania for all things French saw us borrow ballet, connoisseur, coquette, coterie, intrigue, and soubrette. I actually had to look up soubrette. Apparently, it's a maidservant or lady's maid as a character in a play or opera, usually one of a pert, coquettish, or intriguing character. Pert. The upshot of all this is that it's now thought that just shy of 30% of the words in modern-day English come from French.
No shit. 30% almost of the English vocabulary is French. Mind blown.
That's huge. And if you take
That's
into account
massive.
the Latin-derived words in English too, you see that the minority of English words are actually Germanic. On the face of it, that seems like a win for those who say English is more of a Romance language than a Germanic one. But not so fast, because what's important here is precisely which words come from where. Because yes, there are lots of French words in English in terms of raw numbers, but the vast majority of the words we actually use day to day are Germanic. Our core vocabulary is overwhelmingly from Old English. On this list of the 100 most frequently used words in English, only one of them is from French.
That's like all the words that I use. All the basic words.
A word that we've recently handed back to the French and they're using to describe their celebrities. Actually, it's funny how French has started re-borrowing words that it gave to English in the first place. It's one of the big themes of Professor Sequilini's book.
La plupart des anglicismes que nous empruntons en ce moment sont en fait de vieux mots français. On le sait pour tennis, qui est tenez, au jeu de paume, on envoie la balle.
His point is that French speakers should actually take heart in the fact that French has permeated the English language so deeply that English is now redistributing it to the rest of the world.
Organisation des Nations Unies. 3 mots français. L'anglais international, c'est du français. Soyez fiers.
Yeah, also United States. That's 2 words from French. States is an interesting one, actually. I dedicated a large chunk of a previous video to this next bit, but a surprising number of ST words in English have a modern French equivalent with E with an accent, T. In the case of state, it's état, but also stage has étage, stranger has étranger. That's because the old French versions of these words started with EST.
With the E.
English dropped the E and French dropped the S. So we may have put our own spin on them, but French words really are everywhere in our language. And undoubtedly, vocabulary is the most profound way in which French has influenced English. But it's not the only way. The grammar of English has changed significantly since Old English, and a large amount of that change happened as the Normans arrived and Old English became Middle English. Now, it's hard to say exactly how much of this change is attributable to French influence. English, for example, has just come into a great deal of contact with the language of the Vikings, Old Norse, too. But there are at least a couple of changes for which French has to be the prime suspect. One of them is that we developed a second way to indicate that something belonged to someone or somewhere, and we still have both now. So nowadays we can say the king's sword or the sword of the king. The first of those reflects the Old English construction, and the second is applying the same formula as French does. It uses a word to suggest possession. In French, de, in English, of, instead of just adding letters to the end of whatever is doing the possessing, like Old English did. In Middle English, it also becomes possible to put an adjective after a noun, although it's not something we do that often these days. But we can still say, for example, move to pastures new instead of new pastures, or we can speak of time immemorial. This is a French construction.
That's more English words that I would say people in Britain or England are actually using. I've never heard anyone use those phrases before here in the States.
See in a lot of job titles like Attorney General, Procurator Fiscal, Notary Public, or when we speak of an heir apparent. And could it even be
like notary public? We just say notary. Attorney General, obviously we use. Procurator Fiscal, I've never even heard that before.
public, or when we speak of an heir apparent? And
call
could
it
it
the
even be
notary.
that the French changed
We don't
the way
use the
we
word
pronounce
heir.
the words we already had? Almost certainly, yes, because during the Middle English period, H's start dropping like flies to an horrible extent, especially
Horrible.
at the start of words. In Old English, the words for lord and lady both began with an H. We also see H dropping that's more familiar to us now, i.e. H is being dropped before vowels, but far from it being something that was seen as a sign of a lack of education back then, as it occasionally is now, it was probably seen as the opposite. Because who's terrible at H's?
I would like to buy a hamburger.
To drop your H's was to sound more French and therefore more prestigious. This might even explain why H dropping is, even now, more prevalent in areas that were historically of administrative and commercial significance, like London and the southeast of England, because in areas that would have had much less French influence, people are less likely to drop their H's. Think about how some people in Scotland will say what or where. They're emphasizing the H's, if anything. And a remnant of this idea that dropping your H's like a French speaker is prestigious is the fact some people still insist on saying an hotel or an historic, effectively treating the H like it isn't there.
Yeah, this is definitely something not familiar to me. And historic and hotel. That's so weird. Oh my gosh.
I think perhaps some people think an historic is more poetic. Which brings me on to another profound change that the French are very likely responsible for. Let me show you something. This is Caedmon's hymn. Written sometime in the 7th century, it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, attested examples of an Old English poem. The key characteristic of this, and indeed all Germanic poetry from the time, is it contains amazing amounts of alliteration. It repeats the sounds at the starts of words over and over. Let's just have a listen to this marvellous reading by Kara Schallenberg. Note the alliteration, but also just see if you spot something else too.
Nu Schulan Herian, Herr von Riches Werd, mehr to the smechte and his mod ye thank. Werk Wuldervader, swa he wonderige ways.
It sounds so beautiful. I gotta just hear it like one more time.
Mehr to the smechte and his mod ye thank. Werk Wuldervader, swa he wonderige ways. Age drichten or unstelde.
So hopefully you heard the alliteration there. But did you also notice something else? It didn't rhyme. Now I know poetry doesn't have to rhyme, but in Old English it never did. It was all about the alliteration. Poetry in English only starts to rhyme after the French turn up. French poetry was known for its rhymes at the end of lines, and that becomes the fashion in England too. Without doubt, the best-known writer of the Middle English period is Geoffrey Chaucer, and Look at this. He ends every line with a lovely little rhyme. And Chaucer was well versed, so to speak, in French.
Chaucer travaille dans les douanes à Londres, il travaille en français.
Yeah, and in the Canterbury Tales, he's using a rhyming technique taken from across the English Channel. So our poetry, our grammar, our vocabulary, and the way we speak. The people of France can indeed claim a part in shaping English into the language it's become.
All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and end it there. My mind's a little blown right now. I realized I wasn't really stopping and talking too much just because it's so interesting. There's so much information that I'm just trying to absorb it with my dumb brain that I have. But whoever recommended this, I'm not too sure. I'll have to check who it was. Appreciate it. This is like right up my alley, especially with what I'm doing lately. Thank you. And with that, I'll go ahead and end the video. I appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you in the next one. I'll have a link down in the description below for RobWords. Peace.